Hey, there's the power button. Hello, welcome to another episode of Forgotten Cemeteries of Pacific Northwest. Good time to get out. I was reminded yesterday, you don't know what you got till it's gone. I had to put my 18-year-old cat down, so reminded me why cemeteries are kind of a special place to go to kind of chill out, gather your thoughts, and quiet place to go. Except this one, it's kind of loud at times. There's a lot of cars coming by, so I'll do my best to film. Anyways, today we're at Blooming Cemetery, located in Blooming, Oregon, Washington County. Alternative names include Blooming Church, Bloomington, St. Paul's Lutheran, and St. Peter's Lutheran. Quite a bit there. So let's go meet some of the local residents and hear their story. A little history about this cemetery. I'll be honest, I've passed this one when returning from the further west cemeteries, and I thought it was a bit vanilla, and if I'm being honest, I was like, it doesn't look too interesting. Until I looked into the history, and there's some interesting history in this cemetery here. The cemetery has various start dates. One source said the first burial could have been as early as 1849, but there was no details on that. Then another says 1856. Oregon Burial Site Guide says 1884, so I'm not really sure what the true start date is. Blooming, Oregon used to be simply called the German settlement. I'm sure you can guess the reason. It was later named by Reverend Paul, who thought that name sucked and changed it to Blooming due to the floral conditions and the pleasant prospects in the area. A post office was established here in 1895 by Henrik Paul, but I think it was kind of short-lived from what I read. The area was also home to St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran Church, apparently the second oldest congregation of the Pacific Northwest. There will be heavy focus on the Volga Germans today. Back in the 18th century, they were Russia Germans who lived along the Volga River in Russia. They were recruited to live there and allowed to keep all their traditions because they were known as skilled farmers and craftsmen. Getting a little loud around here with these trucks. As the years passed, some decided to give America a shot. Mainly landed in Kansas, Nebraska, and Dakotas. Lucky them, as I read about the Great Purge that took place in Russia during 1937. Volga Germans were heavily targeted during this event, primarily just due to their ethnicity. It is estimated that 1.5 million Volga Germans died in concentration camps in Siberia and Asia during this dark time. So, dark piece of human history there. Now that I've depressed you today, we'll meet some of the first Volga Germans to come to America and why they came here to Oregon. Stop by an individual who was murdered, who has zero details, by the way, that was weird, and learn some strange Volga folk medicine, so that should be fun. And way in the back of the cemetery, you'll find the Homan, and you see the name here, Enrique Maria Concock Holman. Whoa, guessing German. As you can see on their headstone, Oregon Pioneers of 1870 is written. I'm honestly unsure if the Germans here fall into that Volga group or not. I couldn't trace that down. But men who worked out on the railway survey teams of the Pacific Northwest and returned back to the Midwest talked about how incredible and beautiful the country was out here. German newspapers started advertising this heavily, and hence the Great Columbia Plain rumor started. I guess the Volga had the 5-year commitment they had to fulfill related to the Homestead Act. As soon as that was up, groups made their way out to the Pacific Northwest. A big target of theirs was Portland, and the picture shown is thought to be the first ship to arrive in Portland with the Volga crew, the steamer Oregon. So whether the Holmans here were on that boat, I do not know. An article I read listed 28 Germans who lived in rural Washington County in 1882. So I'd say this count as rural out here, so who knows. Cool find here of Adam Hergert Sr., born in Russia in 1855 and son of Philip Hergert. Now remember that Volga story I told you? Turns out Adam's father lived along the Volga River in Russia during that time, so here's a neat origin connection. Adam's parents would immigrate to the U.S. in 1876 on the steamship called the Mosel. They lived in Kansas for a bit, and they must have seen that new article about how amazing the Pacific Northwest was. So they were among the first Volgas to arrive in Oregon in 1881, specifically referred to as the Kansas group from my readings. He would work at the Oriental Hotel in Portland. Couldn't find any historical info on that hotel, but from what I read, Volga crew lived there quite a bit. They would first hang out in Portland, but after a few months they made their move out here to Washington County farmland. In addition, I also read they were founding members of St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Blooming in 1882, an alternative name to the cemetery. Alright, apologies if I talk too fast during my presentation. There is a lot of big farm trucks out here in traffic, so I don't want to get drowned out too much. But here's the headstone of the Germans family. That's how you say it. This family was also part of the first Volga group that arrived in Oregon in 1881. The article is interesting in that it explained the groups that moved out here described this area as full of old growth timber trees, and they needed to fell them to make room for their farming. Not much these days, just cookie cutter apartment complexes and fancy bloated houses with crazy drivers based on what I've seen. The pioneer children attended a local parochial school where lessons were taught in English half of the day and the other half was in German. However, lessons in German ended during the start of the World War I. What may be the most odd and most dodgy individual in this cemetery is the headstone of John D. Letterick. Unknown on birth year or where. I think actually when I looked on Find a Grave, I typed his last name in. I don't think anybody came up but him. And it shows him immigrating in 1887, but that's about all I found, and I'm guessing from Germany. Odd one, but his headstone reads, who was murdered on or about 1894, so they're not even sure when he got murdered. So I couldn't track down any information, sadly, just nothing, but hopefully someone out there knows more than I do, or maybe there's some little tidbit of information I would have liked to know in his story. And our final little chat here involves Volga folk medicine. One of the more interesting pieces of information that I think it's worth bringing up, since my channel focuses on pioneer history, and the Volga has some interesting folk practices. Let's read about them. They didn't have doctors in their communities. However, there were certain people in the villages with the title brohari. Basically, they're local healer, I'm guessing. And from my reads, the Volga weren't too trusting of Portland doctors, so they heavily turned to these healers for cures. And this is where things got a bit interesting and just like outright odd, some of the treatments. If you practice brohari, you're often labeled as a white witch. However, we know there can't be good without evil, right? Some Volga Germans practice hexerei, a black witch, or simply hex. And it is believed that the white witch could counteract whatever the black witch did to you. It got a little confusing at times because it seemed like there was no separation between folk magic and their Christian beliefs, and their main goal was just healing and protection spells and treatments. This paper I found describes one of the first treatments used by the midwives to treat babies who were cried obsessively, colic basically, was pretty interesting. This is a good example of folk medicine. The midwife would scrape bird droppings from the fence and then mix it with milk, fed it to the baby, and they claimed it would wake up 100% cured of its crying behavior. The paper described the Volgans as keeping flowers in their yard, and they often would use the milky substance for medicinal purposes. That flower just happened to be the poppy, so heroin. So I guess the theory was that if the birds ate the poppy seeds, they would sort of dilute down the strength, allowing the folk medicine treatment to be effective for babies. Another odd treatment was if you had a massive wound, you would tie it with a cloth and shove it in cow crap. And in my research, the Volgans weren't the only ones who were using cow dung to treat their wounds. Africa communities used to treat burn wounds with it, so it must be doing some good, whether it's preventing infection or what, I do not know. Another fun treatment was for warts and boils, where you would treat it with a cut potato. You would cut it in half, and you would hold it on the wart, giving it a quarter turn and say, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost." You would then bury the potato. Apparently you had to do this like 7 nights in a row or it wasn't effective. I hope you don't mind. I'm kind of jumping around the cemetery, showing you some cool headstones and telling some folk magic stories of the Volga. And this person's name is Stresse. It's an interesting last name. I've been Stresse since my cat died yesterday. Sorry. Alright. As far as the hex witches, not all of them sold their soul to the devil, as most claimed per one paper. But then another one confused me even more, but I think it was more directed towards Pennsylvania folk Dutch magic. I think there was a separation there between the Volgas and the Dutch, if I read it right. They claim in order to become a witch, the hex one would have to take on 3 ways of becoming a dark witch. The first one was boil a black cat or toad alive, toss the bones into a stream or creek. 1 bone will float against the current. This will become the witch's source of power. The second one, draw a circle on the ground with coal. Step into the circle holding out your hand. The devil will appear. That seems like the laziest of all of them. The third one, stand next to the manure pile while swinging a hook in the air like a lunatic. The person must deny Christ and promise themselves to the devil. That was pretty deep, that one. Regardless, I read that the kids were often scared of the older ladies in villages sometimes, fearing they might put a hex on them. So that was pretty crazy. Villagers often used talisman for protection purposes, hung eels, fish heads, or horseshoes in their barns, for example. A final treatment I read about was for toothaches, and how fitting involves a cemetery. And this particular headstone, not this particular headstone, but the design. The story goes that one individual was told that his toothache would go away if he went to a cemetery between 1 and 12 o'clock and pinched off a piece of a cross with his fingernails. He was then told to stick the tooth 3 times with the silver in the name of God, and the toothache would go away. Never knew if that guy got better of his tooth, but if you'd like to avoid that root canal, visit a cemetery, I guess. This may be the shortest tour ever on this channel. I purposely did that last part for you guys. Kind of just jumped around and found some interesting headstones. It's a small one. It's a bit vanilla, yeah. Kind of boring looking, yeah. But very interesting history once you look into the Volga Germans. Very heavy on the religious, but as we found, a little bit of folk magic in there that was interesting. We'll make our way down to that one that I think I used in one shot. Very interesting design. Looks like we got some brackets. I don't know, somebody left something there, but kind of a neat headstone, huh? And some symbology for you guys. I always say symbology. I still don't know if that's a word. I should probably stop saying it. But hope you enjoyed this one. Hope you enjoyed the folk magic stories and a little bit of pioneer history and some overseas history as well, as far as Russia. Sounds like it's a good thing that the Volga Germans got out of that area that came to Oregon. Find John in the back. Like I said, I couldn't find absolutely anything about what happened to him on allegedly April 14th, 1894. But if you have any other recommendations for cemeteries to visit in Oregon or even southern Washington, feel free to pipe up below. If you're a German translator, this will be a good cemetery for you to visit. Practice your German, because there's a lot of headstones with German on them. Hope you're doing all right out there and enjoying summer. Stay safe and have a great one.